We're playing Washington, D.C. alphabet soup today. A couple of weeks ago, we had Commissioner Ajit Pai from the FCC. Before that, we had Jessica Rosenworcel, another FCC member. And just to balance things up, to make things fair, we got an FTC member, Julie Brill, Commissioner Julie Brill. Welcome to INNOVATE2016.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, Julie, silly question from your point of view, but maybe not from our listeners. What's the difference between the FCC and the FTC and the FCC, and do we really need both of them?
Absolutely, we need both of them. So the Federal Trade Commission focuses on consumer protection and competition enforcement, and we look at a very broad spectrum of the economy. We're not just focused on telecommunications firms and other common carriers. Rather, we are looking at everybody, whether they're telemarketers or advertisers or publishers, or in the competition space, we look at pharmaceutical manufacturers who might be merging. We look at all sorts of industries. So we have a very broad mandate, and we specialize in these issues by looking at everything from the consumer's perspective. So we're looking at unfair and deceptive acts and practices that could harm consumers, or we look at unfair methods of competition that may at the end of the day harm consumers as well if markets get too concentrated.
You and I first met actually at a privacy seminar.
And right.
So you do a lot of privacy stuff.
We do a lot of privacy because that all comes under the consumer protection jurisdiction. So we do a tremendous amount of privacy enforcement and policy work. In fact, I believe that we are the nation's leading privacy enforcement agency.
Are you a friend or foe of Silicon Valley when it comes to privacy?
I believe we are a friend. I believe what we do is we help Silicon Valley think about things from the consumer's perspective, get privacy right, think about data security from day one, think about privacy from day one. Now, we have brought actions against some companies.
For example?
Google, Facebook, MySpace, Twitter.
Small companies.
And, but also some very small companies too, because they were engaged in activities that had a real impact on consumers, whether it's data brokers or ad networks or analytics firms or some hardware manufacturers. So we don't discriminate, we're just looking at what the practices are. But we also, in addition to doing enforcement actions, we hold workshops. We bring in stakeholders to talk about issues. We issue reports to talk about, you know, we did one on big data. Is it a tool for inclusion or exclusion? That was just issued today. We've done them on Internet of Things. We've done them on consumer-generated health information. So we look at cutting-edge issues.
Julie, again, you know this better than I do. The data privacy issue is a hot political subject in Europe, particularly in Germany, but generally within the EU.
Yeah. It's
less of one here. The candidates don't seem to be talking about privacy. It's not something that resonates with the voters here. Why not?
That's a good question. I do think that there are sectors in the United States, consumer advocates, stakeholders, companies, who are thinking a lot about privacy and data flows. And not only are they thinking about it a lot in terms of whether it's national surveillance and the Snowden revelations, or whether it's with respect to some of the very large companies, or data brokers and other entities that are taking very sensitive information or creating sensitive information and profiling consumers. So there is a conversation in the United States, and it's particularly robust, but it's not widespread. Whereas in Europe, there is also a very robust conversation, but it's much more widespread. It's really reached out into sort of a popular
Why don't you think that American citizens seem to be as sensitive about privacy as European ones?
I think for some, Europe is not monolithic.
Well, Germany, for example.
Okay, if we want to talk about Germany, and I've spent a lot of time in Germany, so Germany has a very special sort of historical situation that it is dealing with, not only out of World War II and how information was used by the Nazi regime, but also the Stasi and the secret police for what was then East Germany, now is half of the country. So they're very sensitive to how information can be used to harm people and can be used by government to harm people. And this goes to another difference that I see in terms of why is it such a focus in a place like Germany but not in the United States. Government use of data in Germany is not, oddly, not as of much concern to them as is corporate use of information. They're thinking a lot about Google, Facebook, MySpace, well, not so much MySpace, but Amazon, right? They're thinking, they call it GAFA, you know, you throw Facebook in there. They're very concerned about how that information is being used and whether it respects their fundamental right of privacy. Here in the United States, we aren't as concerned, oddly, about how companies are using data, and I mean the broad populace. Whereas we are, I think, more focused on government use of data. And that's why you've seen reforms like USA Freedom Act after the Snowden revelations.
What other political issues, Julie, do you expect to come up which might touch on your agency? What about network neutrality? I know that seems to be falling somewhere between your agency and the FCC.
I do think network neutrality is obviously going to continue to be a big policy issue. I don't know whether it'll come up in the election, but I wouldn't be surprised if it does, because it is a very hot, and it's actually a very important issue. You know, how internet service providers treat consumers, how they treat competitors, how they treat their vertical partners, either friends or foes, is going to be very important for innovation going forward. I'm a big supporter of the open internet order, which is going to, you know, if it is upheld by the courts, will require the ISPs to treat everybody the same as they're passing through.
But won't this Title II legislation, won't it give more power to agencies like yours? A lot of people in Silicon Valley are nervous about that.
It will. I think the concern is that the concern, as I'm hearing it articulated by some stakeholders, is that it would give much more power to the FCC. This goes back to your first question. What's the difference between the FTC and the FCC? So the Federal Communications Commission will now, through the Open Internet Order, have jurisdiction over broadband providers and will be able to issue rules like how will they be able to use data going forward? Should they be treated like Google and Facebook, or do ISPs have a special responsibility given their role in the ecosystem, and should they be subject to different rules?
But does this conceivably result in an internet that can be more and more regulated if this legislation actually takes place?
So my view, it's a rule, not legislation, just to be clear, although there might be...
What's the difference?
Legislation is enacted by Congress, and a rule
regulation.
Oh, yes, it's a regulation or rule, yes, as opposed to legislation,
right.
Yes. It's interesting because I think there's a strong argument to be made that in the absence of something like the Open Internet Order, that new startups, new players who want to get into the market would have more difficulty because they might be disadvantaged, they might be discriminated against. And so what the rules are designed to do is to kind of give everybody equal footing. The idea is to not disadvantage anyone, but so everybody has an equal footing and an equal shot at getting to the consumer.
Take off your FTC hat,
sure,
if you can, for a minute. What do you think are the principal issues of making the American economy, especially when it comes to digital, more innovative?
I do think that there is an important concept that government, if it's going to step in, needs to do so very carefully and needs to do so in a way that is not going to stop innovation. So for instance, think about the sharing economy, you know, the gig economy, whatever we want to call it. We did a workshop on that. It was a great workshop. We brought in stakeholders from all walks of this, or all parts of this discussion. It's quite clear that there are entrenched players at the state level who represent industries who are trying to stop some of the disruptive players. They're trying to do it through regulations, they're trying to do it through rules, through some mechanism or another. We at the FTC, wearing our competition hat, will often comment and tell them they shouldn't do that, or they should think carefully before they stop an innovative player just because they want to ensure that the entrenched player doesn't get harmed. So there's a very important role for thinking about it from a competition perspective. But there's also an important role for thinking about it from a consumer protection perspective, right? We have some old rules, like taxi drivers or people who are going to give rides to consumers need to have insurance. Because if there's an accident, they need to make sure that they have enough coverage that the consumer isn't harmed. These are important rules that protect consumers and promote health and promote welfare. So I think the trick is, in dealing with something like the sharing economy, is to be subtle and nuanced and to really examine what the rule is that is of concern and to figure out, is it promoting consumer welfare or is it really promoting some entrenched players' interests? And we're really well situated to do that at the FTC. So I think that's a really important issue going forward, is being smart about how you do regulation so that you're focused on consumers' interests, not competitors' interests.
And do you think that the Ubers and the Airbnbs and the Lyfts of the world, are these just the tip of the iceberg? Is every industry now going to be radically transformed, or to use the Silicon Valley word, disrupted by the sharing economy?
I think many will. I don't know if everyone will. But I do think that there, I frankly hope that there will be disruption in the sense that there'll be more innovation, because I think at the end of the day it benefits consumers. That's always my number one concern. Are consumers being benefited or are they being harmed? And maybe if it's a mixed bag, how can we ensure that the harm is minimized while the benefits are promoted?
So Julie, final question in that vein. How important is the 2016 presidential election from the perspective of the American consumer?
I think the 2016 election will be important to American consumers. I think it makes a big difference who's in office in terms of who they then put into places like an independent agency like the Federal Trade Commission or an independent agency like the Federal Communications Commission. They select people, and those people create policies, and those policies impact consumers. So I do think that the election, any election, including 2016, does make a difference.
Well, Commissioner Julie Brill, one of the things I think you do, excusing the pun brilliantly, is give a real human face to these agencies. Often people in Silicon Valley think that these agencies are run by robots or bureaucrats, but you're clearly neither of those.
No.
Real honor to have you on Innovate 2016, and I hope we'll have you back again soon to talk more about the election. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it. Thank you. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.